Hello students, when there is too much of something, somehow the other person comes and tells us too much is too bad. Shall we take example? So when you laugh too much, if there is an elderly person at home, will come and tell you, stop, it irritates, very next moment you will cry. And then when there is too much of crying, someone else again comes and tells you, okay, accept the situation, go with the times, now get up and come on the way. Another example, your mother is making pancakes at home and you're sitting and eating so happily, you eat 1, 2, 3, she tolerates. And when you're eating the 5th pancake, she naturally tells, stop it. So what did these examples highlight? When there is too much of something, there is a kind of a resistance to it. So what are we talking today? We are talking the resistance theory in literature. That is the resistance to something that is there in literature. It has a big history. We have in the final year optional literature many modern theories, and even till date the theories are cropping up. From the 19th century till the 20th century, and even in the 21st century, we are seeing one after the theory eating the heads of lovers of literature. So you have structuralism, you have modernism, you have postmodernism, colonial, post-colonial, deconstruction, so many things that have cropped up. So resistance theory is also one of these modern theories which has come in the study of language and literature. Now, when it comes to a theory, you can't study it so formally and so technically. So I always give some colloquial or desi kind of examples to my students. So now let us pick 1 or 2 examples that happen with us in everyday life, and let us see what we grasp out of it. Now we have a friend called Appu. He has bought a nice shirt for the first time. He has paid rupees 2000 for it. And he's so happy wearing it that he wants to see what kind of comments and what kind of compliments his friends are going to pass on him. So now, after having worn the new shirt, first he goes and meets Mr. A, who is the owner of a ready-made shop. Since Mr. A has a kind of a taste for dress and clothing, he says, see Appu, the shirt that you're wearing is quite good, its color is also good. But I think if it were, a little bit cut on the side, so it would have had its own grace, or else if the pocket was, a little bit longer, it would look much better. So taking the compliment and a comment together, he goes to the next person. He is a tailor, and he also has the taste of clothing and shirting and suiting. So now he tells Appu, look, if the sleeves had been a little bit like this and the shirt had been a little bit longer and a little bit shorter in the back, it would look quite modern and quite fashionable also. Now he accepts the compliments from the tailor, and then he goes to the next Mr. C. Mr. C is a textile industry owner, and he also has the taste of clothing. So when he looks at the shirt, he says, well, there's nothing wrong with the shirt. It's beautifully stitched. Only thing is that I worry about your the texture of your cloth. Instead of cotton, there should have been some silk or a polyester cloth, so the shirt would have looked better. So now, accepting all these remarks from his friends, he comes back home happily, thinking that next time when he goes to purchase a shirt, he would recommend so these things to the owner of the shop so that he can get a better shirt for himself. And this is how he renovates his thought. Now, let us shift a bit here now. Next time, Appu has written a beautiful drama. Now, Appu goes again to 3 people who are his good friends. So, the first person that he meets is doing MA in English, and he knows what literature is all about, and he has studied from Aristotle to Eliot. So now he can look at the work and decide how good and how bad. He has a critical approach. So when he goes through Appu's drama, he says it has a beautiful storyline, but then if the hero of the story would have been like this, and if the heroine or the protagonist of the story had behaved like this, it would have been far more better. So he picks up the compliment, he goes to the next person who is doing his research in English literature and language, and then he reads his drama, and and says that, Appu, there are very few characters in the drama, so it would have been better if you had introduced chorus instead of the character himself going on with a dramatic monologue or a soliloquy. If you would introduce a chorus and this could change the mood of the people, it would have been far better, but it's okay, your book is very good. Then he goes to another person who is in the field of teaching English literature, and when he reads the drama, he tells, yes, there is everything is beautiful, but then the ending could have been like this. It is too tragic in its way, so something else could have been added, so there is very less humor in the book. Or otherwise the book is very good. Now Appu returns back home and he is very happy that he has written a book and it has got good compliments from the people who have taste for literature. Now let us shift the situation from here to another thing. Now Appu again has bought a new shirt. Now he goes to 3 different people. Those who do not know much about the clothing texture or the fashion, anything. So the first person he meets is a kind of a painter. And then he goes, Appu goes to the painter and says, look, how do I look in this shirt? And then he almost has a brush in his hand. He runs to Appu and paints different colors on his shirts and says, okay, this combination would look better. And now you're looking something else. But the harm that he is causing to the shirt, the painter doesn't know. And then he moves to another person who is a football player who has just returned from his games. So then he has his hands in mud. So then the moment Appu comes, he holds Appu his sleeves and he says, yeah, it's a very nice kind of a dress, and he rubs his whole body and immediately the shirt has all dust in it. And very next moment, he goes to another friend of him who is a mason, who has a sickle and who has some cement in his hand. And the moment Appu goes there, he, in the hurry of holding him, there are holes in the shirt. So with all these things happening, when Appu comes back home and looks himself in the mirror, then what has happened to the shirt? I had just been to get a kind of a compliment or a comment from a distance. But now what have they done with my shirt? It's almost torn. So I think I did a wrong thing going to people who do not know the meaning of shirt or the meaning of texture or textile. So this is completely wrong on my side. And again what happens with Appu? He carries the book. He writes a kind of a drama again. Now he goes to 3 different people. And initially he had gone to the people who had a literary taste. Now first he goes to a historian and says, okay, read my drama. And when the historian reads it, he is shocked. He says, what is this? You have written so much of Subhash Chandra Bose in it, and you have not given any appeal to Gandhiji's freedom movement. So this book has to be studied from the historical point of view. So the literary study was forced with a kind of a historical approach. And there was a kind of a strange intervention from that historian to the book. And then he goes to another man who is a physician, who is a psychologist. And when he looks at the book, he says, what kind of characters do you have? They're so mentally imbalanced. I think you want to stress on the psychological aspect of your characters. So better approach the book. Ask your readers to approach the book from the psychological, analytical point of view. And then he goes to another person who is a lady who runs some institutions for women. And then she says, what have you made of the female characters in the book? And you have shown that in the end of the book, the female character dies. So I want to look at the book from the feministic point of view. There is no justice for the female in your character. Appu grasps his book, grabs it and runs back to his home and now wonders, what have they made of the book? I have written a book and it needs a kind of a literary appreciation or a literary kind of a critical analysis, but then these people belonging to different fields want to impose their fields on literature. This is something injustice to the literature in general. So out of these 2 examples, we are going to see that when a book is written and it is given for critical analysis to those people who have a taste in literature, that would be a justifiable remark for the book. But then when the same literary text goes into the hands of people who don't have the essence of literature, who do not know who is Aristotle or who is Eliot, what kind of appreciation those people could give? They would look from their point of view. So they come from a different area, they come from a different program, from a course. So their understanding of literature is so less. Friends, what am I telling you all about? The fate of literature has come to such a point now. The rawness, the purity of literature somewhere has been lost in the later 19th and 20th centuries. There are so many areas interfering into the field field of literature, and literature is a kind of a chemical mixture full of odor rather than fragrance. So, resistance to this kind of interference from social sciences or natural science into the field of literature is very essential today, as is being told by those people who defend this resistance to theory. Now, if we want to know what is theory or what is resistance theory, we just can't immediately jump into this part of knowledge. We have to understand first what is literary criticism, and then what is literary theory or critical theory, and then come to know what is just theory. And this theory is being introduced for studies now. Where have we lost the literary criticism then? Well, we will have to go back to Aristotle. And before Aristotle, we had Plato, who said there is no such outcome from arts, so there is no meaning in introducing arts to university students, because art is mere fallacy. It doesn't stand with truth like the science stands with. So he had literally banned arts during his time. But then his disciple Aristotle, with the writing of his book Poetics, defended arts, and he said art creates man. Art can create a better future for man, and it has never cheated. It is the good art has always encouraged, and it has always upheld the good in the man and the society. And since there was a kind of a tug of war between Plato and Aristotle regarding the concept of mimesis, Aristotle had to defend mimesis. What is this mimesis? Again, students, without knowing the concepts, you can't jump into theories. Mimesis is a Greek term which says copying something, imitation of something, but in better terms we can call it as representation of something. Now, what was Plato's stand? Look, when there is a piece of literature written, or there is when some fine art happening, it doesn't happen all of a sudden. It has to imitate something, because most of the art depends on the imaginary capacities of the artist. So imagine now that God has created a rose. When God creates a rose, God has the concept of a rose in his mind. So the God's concept of rose in the mind is the first thing, and then when a rose is created, it is the second thing. And when there is a painter who is looking at the rose, and he has painted looking at the rose. So, and then there is the man of literature who is looking at the painting and getting enthralled of the concept of rose, of the beauty of rose, and he is writing something. So now when you come to a person who is writing about a rose, looking at the painting, whatever he has written is thrice removed from reality. And what could this teach humans? It could only entertain, but it will reach nowhere. But then this was not the case. Aristotle had to defend that whenever there is a kind of an imagination, whenever we copy something, we have always ended up with something better. So when we see a thing, its merits and demerits, we take it up, we imitate it, and when we produce it for the future, there is a beautiful reproduction of the same thing in a different manner. So that is giving a best thing to someone than the good thing. So good better becomes best in art. Let us take an example. So how do people imitate and how do people write better? We have a Valmiki. So Valmiki was there as a robber in the forest. There are many stories regarding him and his birth. Let us take this story. People say this is fact most of the time. So Valmiki was a robber in the forest. Now, he was not a robber originally, but then there was a famine and he had nothing to do, and he had to feed his wife. So he used to rob people, and people were so scared of him, and one fine day he met the Saptarishis who were going that way, and he fell on them and he wanted to rob them also. So one of the rishis stopped him and said, instead of doing this, I will preach you some mantra, so you keep humming it, so then one or the other day you will have its result. So the mantra is being taught to Valmiki. His name was not originally Valmiki, he was Ratnakar. Later on he becomes Valmiki. So now Ratnakar starts meditating, sitting somewhere in the beautiful, peaceful atmosphere of the nature. So he is so much engrossed in that mantra that there is an ant hill which grows on him. Because he sits for a long time. There's such a big ant hill, and the same Saptarishis, when they are returning, they're very happy to see Ratnakar having meditated over this, and since there is ant hill around him, they call him Valmiki. Valmika means ant hill in Sanskrit. So from then he becomes Valmiki, and now they tell him. So the Brahma also comes to earth, the Narada also comes to earth, and all the deities are standing there, and they bless Valmiki that your prayers have reached us. Now we gift you the art of writing. So now you have to produce some beautiful script or a kind of an epic, and they vanish. Now Valmiki doesn't know from where will he get this inspiration from, because to create any kind of an art, there has to be some model or there has to be something in front of the eye so that we could do better on that. So he is waiting for the inspiration, and one fine day he's sitting there and he sees two birds. They are lovers. We call it crown chapakshi, that is dove, or we can call them crane. So they are so much engrossed in love. They're playing games, and there is a hunter who comes and shoots the male. So the male bird dies. And the pain of the female is so much that keeps observing, Valmiki keeps observing at the pain of the female bird, that there is endless pain being expressed, because these birds, whether it is doves or cranes, they are known in our mythology, they are known even in history. Even Jahangir has written about these cranes. They are known for love making, and they have a kind of a strong family bond in them. So this is how the reference of crane comes there. Now, having imagined the lady's pain, having imagined the dying man's pain, immediately he is inspired, and the muses bless him, and he sees in front of his eyes Rama and Sita and all the happenings of the Ramayana. And this is how the Ramayana was created. So what does this story tell us about? This is a fact rather. This tells us that when you imitate something, you write things as it is, but for the betterment of people ahead. So a beautiful epic came of this particular imagination. So mimesis is good. So this is how Aristotle, after having studied Sophocles, Euripides, or Dante, Homer, he had to come up with some poetical theory, because nobody had worked on it before him. So now, keeping all these books as base, he comes out with a special kind of a literary criticism, that in case you want to write something in the field of literature, these people will be a kind of models, and keeping them as the base, he came with various forms of literature like the tragedy, comedy, epic, whatever. And since then, each genre, or whether if it is tragedy, it had to have a plot, a scene, so many acts, and then the characters had to be like that. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end, and it has to have a catharsis. So what should be discussed in comedy, and what should be discussed in a tragedy, what should be there in an epic. So everything was so beautifully scripted in his book Poetics. And since then, the study, not only the study of literature began, but also the study of literary criticism began. And also, to study any text from the literary point of view, you wanted a literary theory. That if there is a tragedy, there is a literary theory. So, each form had a literary theory of its own on which the literary criticism stood. So, this is how begins the study of theory. But then remember, when we say literary theory, it's a kind of a prefix added to theory. The theory doesn't stand completely on its own. Nowadays, literary theory is also called as critical theory. So, critical is again a prefix added to theory. So, this was well and good, because anything that was worked on a work of art, it was it did not go beyond the horizons of the of any literary studies. So, literary study had its own boundaries, and any critical analysis on a certain text had to be done depending on those boundaries. So, we couldn't trespass the boundaries of literature. That is how literature and literary criticism both became rich. So, the more the literature, the more the literary criticism. This continued in a very beautiful way in the coming generations also. Then after that, we can refer to Philip Sidney, who came with his an apology for poetry, who defended Elizabethan poetry. Many a time the Elizabethan poetry was of course had to carry some bad remarks, because the poet were corrupt. So this is what the people used to talk. They were corrupt in mind. But then with his defense of poetry in his book Apology for Poetry, this was a very beautiful analysis of the existence of poetry and the need of poetry in life. Then from Philip Sidney we come to Dryden, who speaks of dramatic poesy. He defended Elizabethan drama. He said drama may of course progress in the coming days also. It may take different forms, but then what we find in the Elizabethan drama cannot be overtaken any time in the near history. So now After Dryden, we can come to Shelley, defense of poetry. There was a lot of criticism regarding the romantic poetry, whether it was Keats' excessive romance or Byron's a kind of a crude romance. So Shelley had to somehow defend romantic poetry because he was a kind of a revolutionary also in his mind. So he wrote his defense of poetry. And see, whether it is Philip Sidney or Dryden or Shelley, they have often given their literary literary criticism to all the works of art written, whether in the past or in the contemporary era. Now it continued again. This beautiful journey of literature, literary criticism, and the application of literary theory to literary criticism continued till Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, almost up to 1920s. So this was from Aristotle to T.S. Eliot is a beautiful journey of the study of literary criticism. Suddenly, with the coming of modernists who came up with strange thoughts, again the contemporary situations, the social, cultural, political life of 20th century and the 19th century, of course, added to this kind of a development in literature also. So with the coming of modernists in 1920, suddenly there were strange questions asked on literature. And when you say that, when you study Macbeth, we naturally tell our students that suspicion in a family or suspicion over pure love is something dangerous, which led to so many things happen in Othello, and over ambition led to so many things in Macbeth. And then what happened in Wordsworth's Lucy Gray poem? She could have chosen some other lover instead of weeping so much. So this is how people started looking at the previous literature. They had a strange critical attitude. Why think that suspicion in a family is bad? Why think that over ambition is bad? So these kinds of questions were asked by the modernists. So we have that title New Criticism, where everything is being questioned. And then how did it continue? It continued up to 1934, and with 1934, and there were two people, Wilson and Marco. These people came with the two strange theories, the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. So these are the two theories that they brought out. With them, what happened? The term literary theory disappeared. Only theory remained. So this is something very harmful to literature, because theory is not just related to literature, it's related to all the disciplines, all the subjects around. It is a set of principles which tells how a subject should be studied and what should be the base of that study. For example, if you want to study economics, there should be a data, there should be a kind of a chart, a graph for you. So depending on that, you will be studying or you will be doing some research. So if it is science, like E is equal to mc square, okay, if there is Newton's law, every action has an equal opposite reaction, okay, take this law and produce something on it. Stop. The first fallacy, the intentional fallacy, says that whatever the writer says, there is no need to look into it. You as a reader has to have your own intervention into the writing. So the author should always be kept. If you take the author too much into consideration, so it will be a kind of an intentional fallacy. You will believe that what the author is saying in a particular work is good, but the author might be saying something else in another book. So his intentions do not matter much in a book. It is your intention that matters much. So this is one kind of approach. And the second, how does it affect the readers? So you will be seeing what book has affected the readers, how on that context, and depending on that you will be reading a book. But don't depend on the response of the readers, because the reader's response differs from this culture to that culture. For example, when Hamlet was played in England, people wept over the condition of Hamlet, and the same Hamlet, when it was played in Germany, people laughed at it. So don't depend on the reader's response. So you be very independent of the book, you be very independent of what the readers are telling about this. So this is what in 1934. And then it moved to 1960s, and you have Michael Foucault who attacked the church, or the discourse on church. He says whatever is written in the discourse of church, that this is what a man should do and this is what a woman should do, is completely fallacy, because it is written by a certain class of people, maybe the aristocratic people or the bishops, who have seen life from their angle and who have seen life according to their contemporary era. So he wrote another book called History of Sexuality, which was totally a kind of aggression towards the discourse of church. So this was a kind of another development in the development of the theory in the modern ages. We don't stop there. Then we come to 1968. We had Roland Barthes, who wrote a book called The Death of an Author. So you take a book, it has its own structure, it has its own words, it has its paragraphs, or it has its stanzas. So depend on those things which will give you knowledge. So there is nothing of an author to see in a book. Don't keep the author in view when you are reading a book. Look at the structure, look at its way, how it flows. So depending on that, you better look at the work of art. And then this is something also related to Nietzsche, who said the death of God. See, the 19th or 20th century is not an era where you will study morals or will study virtues or the existence of God. Because what according to Nietzsche was the existence of God? People come together, live in a society, live in harmony, they reciprocate and they respect each other's values, and anything that is of self-interest, they will sacrifice for the common interest of all. What did Lord Krishna say? Lord Krishna spoke of disinterestedness. That is, when you sacrifice your own self-interest, you come to the state of harmony or state of peace in society. So, this is all interrelated to such an extent that when we look at a book, we don't have the author. When we look at a book, we don't see at the critique as to what people are saying. And when we look into the book, we don't want to look into the morals and ethics, because we consider that all those morals and ethics depended on that particular period, or or the conditions that existed contemporarily. So this is how a text got interpreted in so many ways. And where do we end up with? After this came the reader's response theory. So, text, for example, there is Milton's Paradise Lost. You give it to someone, and each of the readers will come with his or her own viewpoint. So, each criticism is taken, is considered. And imagine in a span of 400 years, there are almost 4 lakhs critical books on Shakespeare, and now the Oxford and Cambridge universities are in a dilemma whether to study Shakespeare from his point of view or from the critical point of view, whether to study Shakespeare's original plays or whether to study him from another's point of view. Such a confusion these theories have done. Now what do I want to say? I'm almost towards the end of this explanation. This critical analysis of a text from so many angles has not stopped. Each day you have a budding sensation coming up. You have the structuralism, and you have the neoclassical outlook, and you have the Marxist outlook. Someone comes from sociological aspect and says, look at the book from the social linguistic point of view. Someone comes from the psychological area, interferes into the literary text and says, look at it from the psychoanalytic point of view. A feminist comes and says that, look at the book from the feminist point of view. From which angle are you going to look? So unless you have a theory, an independent theory of your own to look at the book, you are a not good reader of literature. You cannot have any commentary on the literature unless you have, okay, I have written a degree, I want to do a degree on Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then what theory would you keep as a base and use? Why can't I study Ralph Waldo Emerson as an independent entity? This is gone now because there are so many theories coming from various different fields, and the literature is being covered by all these theories. And to stop this, we have the resistance theory today. Enough, it is too much now. Let's go back to Aristotle, let's go back to those ages, and let's study the book as an independent entity. This resistance theory and all its followers, when did this come into place? Because I think this book was written by Paul D. Mann. He wrote an essay called The Resistance to Theory, and then this big sensation began. Let's stop now. Let's be lovers of literature. Let us not welcome so many different things into people into literature and spoil the aesthetic pleasure. Can you believe this is not the time to teach my students the meaning of aesthetic pleasure, because first they have to learn a theory, then I can give them a book. So recently I got a call from my student who came and told me, ma'am, I saw a Marxist movie. I wondered, Marxist movie in which language? He said Kannada. Is there a Marxist movie in Kannada? He said, yes ma'am, I saw KGF. So how is that a Marxist movie? He said because Marxism talks about the class struggle and the labor struggle, and that is what is portrayed in the movie. So the movie has a Marxist approach. My students today at least know what theories are. But dear children, this is not all. In one or the other way, we are bringing harm to the original texts, original beauty of literature. So some or the other day, this resistance will stop the budding theories invading and literally preying the beauty of nature. So better understand before you follow or before you pick up any theory and move towards a beautiful literary text. So this is not the end. It continues. The study of theory continues. Let's study again about this in the coming videos also. Thank you.